The metallic clang of dishes against the stainless steel counter reverberated throughout the kitchen of Belle Note, mixing with Chef Romano's booming commands and the ever-present hum of the exhaust fans, which never quite managed to banish the combined sense of garlic, tomato, and burnt oil. My feet ached inside the cheap, non-slip shoes I'd bought on clearance 3 months prior, the insoles already flattened from the double shifts that had become my normal. I could feel every little bump and ridge in the rubber mat beneath me as I loaded another tray with plates of ossobuco, the rich aroma making my empty stomach twist with a hunger I'd grown accustomed to ignoring. 6 hours into my shift, with 4 more agonizing hours still to go. The numbers played in my head like a broken record, a countdown to the moment I could finally collapse on my worn-out futon and pretend, for a few precious hours, that my life hadn't devolved into this relentless cycle of exhaustion and anxiety. The restaurant's intentionally dim lighting, meant to create a romantic ambience for the customers, only seemed to highlight the dark circles under my eyes when I caught my reflection in the polished chrome of the coffee machine. 24 years old, and I already felt ancient, weighed down by the burdens of responsibility that should have taken decades to accumulate. Ava, table 12 needs water, and Vincent wants you to cover the VIP section tonight. Maria's voice sliced through the cacophony of the kitchen. My supervisor, standing near the pass with her ever-present clipboard, mechanically checking off orders with the detached efficiency of someone who'd long stopped caring about the people toiling behind the scenes to fulfill them. Sophia called in sick again. So you're at the VIP section. My jaw tightened involuntarily, but I nodded, grabbing a clean apron from the hook near the server's station. The VIP section meant bigger tips, a lifeline I desperately needed, but it also meant catering to entitled customers who treated servers like mere furniture, talking over us and around us, but never actually to us. Not really. I'd become skilled at perfecting the invisible smile, the deferential nod, the art of being present without actually being seen. I reached up and touched the small gold cross at my neck, a nervous tic I developed in the 3 months since my mother's diagnosis. The necklace had belonged to my father, one of the few tangible reminders I had left of him since the night, 5 years ago, when his squad car had been ambushed in the warehouse district. For officers dead, including Officer Thomas Morrison, my father, murdered in a coordinated hit by organized crime that the department still hadn't managed to solve. The investigation had stalled within months, buried under mountains of bureaucratic red tape and unspoken warnings to let sleeping dogs lie. My mother had never been the same afterward, and neither had I. The weight of that cross against my collarbone grounded me as I pushed through the swinging door into the dining room, carefully balancing a tray of water glasses. Belle Note occupied a renovated brownstone in Little Italy, its walls decorated with black and white photographs of the old neighborhood, back when the mob openly controlled these streets, without pretense or apology. Now they operated behind the facades of legitimate businesses, charity galas, and political contributions, but everyone knew they were still there, still pulling the strings, still making people vanish when it suited their purposes. The main dining room buzzed with the usual Friday night crowd. Couples celebrating anniversaries, families gathering for birthdays, tourists in search of authentic Italian cuisine in a city overrun with imitations. I moved between the tables with practiced ease, refilling glasses, taking orders, delivering food, all while maintaining the professional distance that shielded me from unwanted attention. The exhaustion had become so ingrained that I barely registered it anymore, just a constant background hum, like the restaurant's can jazz music. Ava, the VIP room is ready. Important guests, very important. Don't screw this up. Maria materialized at my elbow, her expression tense. The VIP room was essentially a private dining area on the 2nd floor, accessible by a narrow staircase concealed behind a heavy velvet curtain. Vincent, the owner, reserved it for special occasions and special clientele, the kind who paid in unmarked bills and never left a paper trail. I'd only been up there twice before, both times to assist with large parties, but never as the primary server. My pulse quickened as I ascended the stairs, my tray laden with menus and a bottle of the restaurant's most expensive Barolo. The mingled aromas of expensive cigars and sophisticated cologne washed over me before I even reached the top step, blending with the flickering candlelight cast by ornate silver candelabras. The VIP room was designed to evoke old-world elegance, with its dark wood paneling, burgundy velvet drapes, and a massive table that could seat 12. But tonight it held only 4 men. They were seated at one end, their heads close together in conversation, their voices hushed and serious. I paused in the doorway, waiting to be acknowledged, carefully arranging my face into a mask of polite neutrality. From where I stood, I could only see the backs of 2 of the men and the profiles of the other 2. They all wore expensive suits, the kind that came from custom tailors on Madison Avenue, not off the rack at department stores. One of the men gestured with a cigar, its smoke swirling lazily toward the ceiling in delicate spirals. "Your server will attend to you now, gentlemen." Vincent's voice startled me from behind, making me jump. He'd followed me up the stairs, which was highly unusual. His mere presence signaled the importance of these particular guests. "Ava is one of our finest. She'll take excellent care of you." Vincent, a nervous energy radiating from his usually composed demeanor, squeezed past me into the room, and that's when I saw him clearly for the first time. The man at the head of the table, the one who commanded the room without even seeming to try, turned his head at the sound of his name, and my entire world seemed to tilt precariously on its axis. Antonio Rossini. Even if I hadn't recognized him from the newspaper clippings my father used to bring home, from the police files I'd sneaked peeks at as a teenager, from the face that haunted my nightmares as the mastermind of my father's murder, I still would have known him. Power emanated from him like heat rising off asphalt on a sweltering summer day, invisible, yet impossible to deny. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe mid-30s, with dark hair swept back from a face that should have been classically handsome, but instead possessed something harder, colder. His eyes, when they met mine, were the color of obsidian black, reflective, and utterly unreadable. Time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously. I stood frozen in the doorway, the wine bottle suddenly feeling incredibly heavy in my hands, my pulse pounding in my ears so loudly I was sure everyone in the room could hear it. This was the man responsible for my father's death. This was the man who ran the Rossini crime family, who controlled everything from the docks to City Hall, who made people disappear and ruined lives with casual indifference. And I was supposed to serve him dinner. "Gentlemen, this is Ava," Vincent was saying, his hand lightly on my shoulder, gently urging me forward. "She'll be taking care of you tonight. Ava, please present the wine to Mr. Rossini." My feet moved on autopilot, carrying me toward the table, even as every primal instinct screamed at me to run, to flee, to disappear. Antonio Rossini observed my approach with an expression that gave absolutely nothing away. Neither interest nor dismissal, just passive observation. The other men at the table had ceased their conversation, watching this mundane ritual of wine service with the same vacant attention they might give any other minor interruption. I set the bottle on the table, my hands trembling almost imperceptibly, focusing intently on the label rather than the man seated mere inches away. My training took over. That ingrained muscle memory honed through hundreds of similar interactions kicked in, and I heard myself reciting the wine's name, vintage, and region in a voice that sounded almost normal. "The 2015 Barolo from Piedmont," I managed, reaching for the corkscrew at my waist. "It's been aged in oak barrels for the traditional 38 months. Open it." Rossini's voice cut through my recitation. Not loud, not harsh, but imbued with an unmistakable authority that brooked no argument and expected immediate compliance. He hadn't looked away from me, I realized with a jolt, not once since I'd entered the room. His gaze felt almost physical, like a palpable weight pressing against my skin, cataloging every detail, every micro-expression I couldn't quite manage to control. I uncorked the bottle, my hands surprisingly steady. Thank God for small mercies. Then I poured a tasting amount into his glass. The wine caught the candlelight as it fell, a deep, ominous red, like arterial blood. I stepped back, waiting for his approval. Every fiber of my being was focused on simply getting through this interaction and escaping this room as quickly as humanly possible. Rossini lifted the glass, swirled the wine with the practiced ease of someone intimately familiar with fine vintages, and took a sip. He held it in his mouth for a fleeting moment before swallowing, his expression remaining utterly inscrutable. The silence stretched, thick with expectation, before he set the glass back down and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "It's acceptable," he said, which I took as my cue to proceed with pouring for the rest of the table. I moved around the table, filling each glass with methodical precision, acutely aware of Rossini's unwavering gaze. He hadn't rejoined the conversation of his companions, hadn't looked away, and the intensity of his focus made my skin prickle with an unsettling sense of unease. When I finished pouring, I stepped back, waiting for further instructions, or, even better, the merciful dismissal that would allow me to flee. "What's your name?" Rossini asked, even though Vincent had already introduced me. The question felt like a trap, a test. "Ava," I answered, carefully keeping my tone neutral. "Professional. Ava Morrison." Something flickered across his face, too fleeting to identify, before his expression settled back into that unreadable mask. "Morrison," he repeated as if tasting the name. "Irish." "My father was," I said, the words spilling out automatically before I could stop them. Too much information. I didn't want him to know anything about me. I didn't want to be memorable or noticeable or anything other than invisible. Was. He noted the past tense, a subtle probe for more information. When I didn't elaborate, he leaned back in his chair, finally breaking eye contact to look at Vincent. "Leave us. We'll call when we need service." Vincent practically tripped over himself to comply, gesturing for me to follow. I gratefully turned toward the exit, my hand already reaching for the curtain when Rossini's voice stopped me cold. "Not you. You stay." I froze, my blood turning to ice. Vincent looked back and forth between us, clearly uncertain, before Rossini's cold stare convinced him to leave without me. The curtain fell closed behind him, the heavy velvet muffling the sounds from downstairs, and I was alone with 4 of the most dangerous men in New York. "Come here," Rossini commanded, gesturing to the empty space beside his chair. It wasn't a request, could never be mistaken for one. And my father's training, his insistence that I learn to handle dangerous situations, warred with my immediate instinct to bolt. I approached on legs that felt disconnected from my body, stopping at what I hoped was a respectful, but not intimate, distance. Up close, I could see details I'd missed before. The faint scar along his jawline, the expensive watch on his wrist, the way his shirt was unbuttoned just enough to seem casual while still projecting absolute authority. He smelled like cedar and something darker, more complex. A cologne that probably cost more than my monthly rent. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, his voice low enough that the other men at the table couldn't overhear. "Yes," I admitted, because lying to Antonio Rossini seemed monumentally stupid. "You're Antonio Rossini. And you're Thomas Morrison's daughter." It wasn't a question. My heart stopped, literally stuttered in my chest, because how could he possibly know that? I'd been so careful, had deliberately kept my last name off social media, had moved to a different neighborhood, had done everything possible to distance myself from my father's legacy. "I don't know what you mean," I tried, but the words came out weak, unconvincing even to my own ears. "Don't insult my intelligence," he said, still in that conversational tone that somehow made the threat more effective. "I make it my business to know everything that happens in this city. Your father was NYPD, killed in the line of duty 5 years ago. Your mother is currently receiving treatment for stage 3 cancer at Mount Sinai. You work double shifts here to cover her medical bills because insurance doesn't cover experimental treatments. You live in a studio apartment in Queens, drive a 12-year-old Honda with a broken taillight you can't afford to fix, and you have $37 in your checking account." Each fact landed like a physical blow, stripping away any remaining illusion of privacy or safety I'd managed to cling to. He'd been watching me, or having me watched, and I had no idea for how long or why. The implications terrified me more than I could articulate. "What do you want?" I whispered, abandoning any pretense of normalcy. Rossini studied me for a long moment, his dark eyes moving over my face with cool, clinical assessment. I want to know why Thomas Morrison's daughter is serving me dinner when she should be running as far from me as possible. His lips curved into something that might have been a smile in a different context. I want to know if you're brave or stupid, Ava Morrison. I'm broke, I said flatly, surprising myself with the sudden honesty. And my mother is dying. I don't have the luxury of running from anything. Something akin to approval flickered in his expression there and gone in an instant. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a business card, black with silver lettering. Nothing else. No company name, no title, just a phone number. Keep this, he said, pressing the card into my palm, his fingers brushing mine in a contact that sent an unwelcome jolt through my system. You'll need it. I won't, I said, attempting to hand it back, but he closed my fingers around it with surprising gentleness. You will, he insisted, sooner than you think. Before I could respond, he turned back to his companions, effectively dismissing me with the gesture. I stood there for a moment, clutching the business card like it might spontaneously combust, before my survival instincts finally kicked in, and I fled, practically running down the stairs and not stopping until I reached the relative safety of the kitchen. Maria found me leaning against the walk-in freezer, struggling to catch my breath, her expression somewhere between annoyed and concerned. What happened up there? Vincent said Rossini requested you specifically stay. Nothing happened, I lied, shoving the business card deep into my apron pocket. He just wanted his wine poured properly. But something had happened, something I couldn't quite define or fully grasp. Antonio Rossini, the man responsible for my father's death, knew exactly who I was. And for reasons I couldn't begin to fathom, instead of killing me, or threatening me, or making me disappear, he'd given me his personal number and told me I'd need it. The rest of my shift passed in a blur of automatic movements and racing thoughts. I avoided the VIP section, sending other servers with their food and wine refills, and counted down the minutes until I could finally leave. When I clocked out at midnight, exhausted and emotionally drained, I found an envelope in my locker with my name, written on the front in elegant script. Inside was $5,000 in cash and a note. Asterisk for your mother's treatment. Consider it payment for excellent service. Asterisk. I stared at the money, my hands shaking, knowing I should refuse it, should throw it away, should want absolutely nothing from the man who had destroyed my family. But my mother's overdue medical bill sat unpaid on my kitchen counter, threatening letters from the hospital arriving weekly, and $5,000 was exactly what I needed to keep her in treatment for another month. I took the money. God help me, I took the money. And I knew with absolute certainty that this was only the beginning. The money sat in my nightstand drawer for 3 days, untouched, like a venomous snake I was too afraid to handle, but couldn't bring myself to throw away. Every time I opened the drawer to grab my phone charger or hand lotion, I saw the envelope, stark white against the faded wooden interior, a physical manifestation of the impossible choice I'd made. $5,000, enough to keep my mother in treatment, enough to buy me another month of hope, and enough to irrevocably bind me to Antonio Rossini in ways I was only beginning to understand. I'd called the hospital Monday morning, my voice remarkably steady as I informed them that payment would be forthcoming for my mother's outstanding balance. The relief in the billing coordinator's voice had been palpable, almost apologetic, as she'd scheduled my mother for the next round of experimental immunotherapy that her insurance company had deemed not medically necessary. Apparently, dying wasn't necessary enough to warrant coverage. My mother, bless her oblivious heart, had been overjoyed when I visited Tuesday evening, her thin face lighting up with a smile that made the dark circles under her eyes seem less pronounced. She'd asked where the money came from, and I'd lied smoothly, telling her I'd picked up extra shifts and borrowed from a coworker. She'd believed me because she wanted to, because the alternative was accepting that her daughter was drowning in debt to keep her alive. Now it was Thursday, and I was back at Bell Note for another soul-crushing double shift, desperately trying to pretend that my world hadn't fundamentally shifted. The restaurant felt different now. Or maybe I was different, hyper-aware of every dark suit that walked through the door, every whispered conversation in Italian, every expensive car that pulled up to the valet stand. I'd become paranoid, jumping at shadows, convinced that Rossini's eyes were constantly on me, even when logic told me he undoubtedly had far more important things to do than watch a struggling waitress. "Ava, you look like hell," remarked Tommy, one of the line cooks, as I grabbed an order of linguine à la vongole from the pass. He was a transplant from Naples with a thick accent and an unfortunate crush on me that I'd been politely deflecting for months. "You sleeping okay?" "Fine," I lied, forcing a weary smile. "Just tired. You know how it is. I didn't sleep okay. I hadn't slept properly since Friday night, since Antonio Rossini had looked at me with those obsidian eyes and casually recited the intimate details of my life like he was reading from a police report. Every night I lay awake in my cramped studio apartment, listening to the sounds of the city through the paper-thin walls, wondering who was watching me, and when they were watching me, and what else they knew that he hadn't revealed. The dinner rush was in full swing, the dining room packed with the typical Thursday night crowd, when I noticed him. A man in a charcoal gray suit sitting alone at table 7. Not eating, not drinking, just watching. Watching me. He was in his 40s, maybe, with silver threads laced through his dark hair, and the kind of nondescript face that you'd forget immediately after seeing it, which somehow made him even more menacing. He'd been there for at least 40 minutes, nursing the same glass of water, his eyes relentlessly tracking my movements around the room. My stomach clenched with anxiety. I tried to convince myself I was simply being paranoid, that not every customer who glanced my way was necessarily connected to Rossini, but the man's attention felt too focused, too deliberate. When I approached with a polite inquiry about whether he'd like to order, he offered a tight smile, the expression never quite reaching his eyes. "I'm waiting for someone," he said, his voice carrying the flat vowels of Brooklyn. "But I'll take a coffee while I wait." Black. I brought the coffee, my hands betrayingly steady despite the fear creeping up my spine, and retreated to the relative safety of the server station. Maria noticed my unease, following my gaze to table 7. "That guy bothering you?" she asked, her protective instincts kicking in. Maria might be tough on her staff, but she had zero tolerance for harassment, and had thrown out more than one handsy customer during her tenure as floor manager. "No," I said quickly, not wanting to attempt to explain the complicated web I'd found myself tangled in. Just seemed weird sitting there not ordering. "Want me to have Vincent talk to him?" The last thing I needed was Vincent, who clearly had his own established relationship with the Rossini family, getting involved in any of this. "No, it's fine. I'm probably just tired and imagining things." But I wasn't imagining things. When my shift finally ended at 11, I left through the back in trance as usual, and found the same man leaning against a black sedan parked in the narrow alley. The streetlight cast harsh shadows across his face, making him look even more sinister than he probably was. Although, given the circumstances, sinister seemed entirely appropriate. "Miss Morrison," he called as I attempted to walk past, my pepper spray already clutched in my hand, my finger hovering over the trigger. "Mr. Rossini would like a word." My heart hammered against my ribs. "I don't have anything to say to Mr. Rossini." "He anticipated you might feel that way," the man said, pushing himself off the car with a lazy grace. "Which is why he asked me to extend a dinner invitation. Tomorrow night, 8 o'clock. He'll send a car." "Tell him thank you, but I'm working," I said, continuing to walk. My keys were now threaded between my knuckles like makeshift brass knuckles. Another self-defense trick my father had taught me. "He's already arranged for someone to cover your shift," the man called after me. And I stopped, fury temporarily overriding fear. The sheer audacity of it, the casual arrogance that assumed I would simply comply without question, made my blood boil. "I don't recall agreeing to any of this," I said, turning to face him squarely. "You accepted his money," the man replied, his tone flat. And there it was, the core truth I'd been desperately trying to evade. "That constitutes an agreement, Miss Morrison. Mr. Rossini takes care of those who accept his generosity, but he expects certain courtesies in return. Like having dinner with him. Like not disrespecting him by refusing dinner when he's been nothing but generous to you." The man's smile was sharp, predatory. "He saved your mother's life. The least you can do is share a meal." The manipulation was obvious, transparent even, but that didn't make it any less effective. I was trapped, bound by a debt I couldn't possibly repay, and entangled in obligations I didn't even begin to understand. Running would accomplish nothing. If Rossini could track me at work, scrutinize my finances, know my mother's medical status, there was nowhere I could hide that he wouldn't eventually find me. Fine, I spat out, hating myself for capitulating. Tomorrow, 8 o'clock. The car will pick you up at your apartment, the man said, satisfaction evident in his voice. We're something nice. Mr. Rossini appreciates when people make an effort. He got into the sedan and drove away, leaving me standing alone in the alley with the distant hum of traffic and the sick feeling that I just made yet another terrible decision in a rapidly growing list of terrible decisions. I walked the 6 long blocks to the subway station, constantly checking over my shoulder, perceiving potential threats in every shadow and every passing stranger. My apartment, when I finally reached it after the interminable train ride back to Queens, felt less like a sanctuary than ever before. Felt more like a cell than an apartment. I locked the door, checked the locks not just once but twice, and then a third time just to be sure before collapsing onto my futon, still fully clothed. Sleep finally came, but it was restless, a fitful slumber haunted by nightmares of my father's funeral, my mother's gaunt and hollow face, and those unnerving obsidian eyes that seemed to see far too much. Friday seemed to drag on forever. I spent the morning at the hospital with my mother. The new treatment appeared to be working wonders. Her complexion was healthier, and her appetite was returning. She held my hand as the nurses adjusted her for, chatting away about a book club she joined with some of the other patients. I just smiled and nodded, trying my best to push away the thoughts of where the money for her treatment was really coming from. "You're so good to me, Ava," she said, squeezing my fingers with surprising strength. "Your father would be so proud of you for taking care of me like this." Her words were like a knife twisting between my ribs. My father would be horrified, disgusted, absolutely enraged that I had accepted anything from the Rossini family. He had dedicated his entire career to trying to bring them down, and he had died because he got too close to exposing their criminal activities. And here I was, about to have dinner with the very man who had likely ordered his death. I left the hospital feeling more conflicted than ever. On the way home, I stopped at a thrift store and used some of the precious little money I had left to buy a simple black dress. It was appropriate for dinner, but not so fancy that it looked like I was trying too hard to impress. I took a shower, dried my hair, applied minimal makeup, and then stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. The car arrived promptly at 7:45 p.m. It was a sleek black town car with tinted windows and a driver who opened the door for me without saying a word. I climbed in, taking note of the luxurious leather interior, the partitions separating the front and back seats, and the complete absence of door handles on the inside. It was a mobile prison, albeit a beautifully appointed one. We drove for about 40 minutes, leaving the city far behind and heading north into Westchester County, where the houses became increasingly larger and more isolated. I watched the neighborhoods transform through the tinted windows, from crowded urban blocks to tree-lined suburbs to winding roads bordered by impressive stone walls and electronic gates. The driver finally turned onto a long, winding driveway that snaked through meticulously manicured grounds, eventually leading to a mansion that looked like it had been transported directly from a grand European estate. The house was constructed of stone and glass. It was a blend of modern architecture and classical elements, and it was lit from within like a beacon against the darkening evening sky. I could make out figures moving behind the enormous windows and hear the faint strains of classical music drifting through the evening air. This wasn't just about wealth. It was about power, consolidated and displayed with an almost casual air of confidence. The driver opened my door, gesturing toward the entrance where a woman in a black dress was waiting. She was older, maybe in her 50s, with steel-gray hair pulled back in an elegant chignon and the kind of posture that suggested either military training or extensive dance instruction. "Miss Morrison," she greeted me, her accent hinting that she was from somewhere in Eastern Europe. "I am Elena, Mr. Rossini's house manager. Please follow me." The interior of the house was just as impressive as the exterior. Marble floors, soaring ceilings, artwork that belonged in museums, and furniture that probably cost more than most people earned in an entire year. Elena led me through a series of rooms, each one more opulent than the last, before finally opening a set of French doors that led to a private terrace overlooking the gardens, which were illuminated by subtle landscape lighting. Antonio Rossini stood with his back to me, gazing out over the grounds. He had a glass of wine in one hand and wore dark slacks and a white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. The casual elegance felt somehow even more intimidating than the suit he had worn before. He turned as Elena announced my arrival, and his dark eyes swept over me with an assessment that felt incredibly invasive. "Ava," he said, my name sounding different in his mouth, more intimate somehow. "Thank you for coming." "Did I really have a choice?" I asked, unable to completely mask the sharp edge in my voice. A slight smile touched his lips. "There's always a choice. You chose to accept my money. You chose to come tonight. Own your decisions, Ava. It makes life much simpler." He gestured to a table set for two, complete with candles, fine china, and more silverware than any reasonable meal could possibly require. I sat down because refusing seemed pointless and because my legs were shaking with a combination of fear, anger, and something else that I didn't want to name. "You've been having me watched," I said as Elena poured wine into my glass. It was Bordeaux this time, and it was probably worth more than my monthly rent. "Of course," Rossini replied, sitting across from me with the same fluid grace that seemed to characterize every single one of his movements. "You're Thomas Morrison's daughter. You hate me. You have every reason to want me dead. I'd be foolish not to keep track of you." The honesty was startling, disarming even. "If you're so concerned that I'll try to kill you, why am I here?" "Because I'm curious," he said, picking up his wine glass but not taking a drink. "You've been working at Bella for 3 months. 3 months, Ava. Serving the very people your father died trying to bring down. You've never once tried to poison anyone. Never slipped information to the police. Never done anything but work yourself to exhaustion. Why?" "Because I need the money," I said flatly. "Not everything is about revenge, isn't it?" He leaned forward, his dark eyes intense. "Your father was killed by my organization. Your mother is dying. You're drowning in debt. Most people in your position would want blood, but you just want to survive. That interests me. I'm so glad my suffering is interesting to you." I snapped immediately, regretting the outburst as soon as the words left my mouth. But Rossini just smiled, seeming pleased rather than offended. "There it is. The fire I knew was there. You hide it well at the restaurant, that perfect, submissive service worker routine. But it's still there, burning underneath." Elena appeared with the first course, some kind of soup that smelled absolutely divine, but that I had no appetite for. Rossini watched as I picked up my spoon, waiting for me to take the first bite, his attention never wavering. The soup was amazing, with complex flavors that I couldn't quite identify, but it might as well have been sawdust for all I could taste it through my anxiety. "I looked into your father's case," Rossini said conversationally, as if he were discussing the weather. "The warehouse ambush, 4 officers dead, 2 wounded. The official report says it was a drug deal gone wrong, that your father and his team stumbled into a situation they weren't prepared for." My hand tightened around the handle of my spoon. "That's what they told us." "It's a lie," he said, his voice matter of fact. "Your father was investigating a money laundering operation. He was close, too close to exposing connections that went all the way to City Hall. The ambush wasn't random. It was ordered." I set down my spoon, my appetite completely gone. "A bayou?" "No," he said, and something in his tone made me believe him. "Not by me. I was 28 years old and still proving myself to my father. I didn't have the authority to order something like that. But I know who did and I know why. And I've known for 5 years while you've believed I was responsible." The world seemed to tilt slightly. "You're lying." "I'm not," he said calmly. "And I can prove it if you're interested in the truth. If you want to know who really killed your father and why the investigation was buried, why would you tell me this?" I demanded, my voice cracking. "What do you want from me?" Rossini leaned back in his chair, studying me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. I told you I'm curious. You fascinate me, Ava Morrison. Your strength, your resilience, your refusal to break despite everything that's been done to you. And I want to see what happens when you finally let yourself feel the anger you've been suppressing. I feel plenty of anger, I said through gritted teeth. No, he corrected. You feel exhaustion and resignation and despair. Anger would be admitting you want revenge, want justice, want blood. Anger would be dangerous. His smile was dark, predatory. I want to see you dangerous. Before I could respond, before I could even begin to process what he was really saying, his phone buzzed. He glanced at it, his expression hardening before he looked back at me with something that might have been regret. I need to handle something, he said. Standing up, Elena will see you home. But think about what I've offered. Ava, the truth about your father. All you have to do is ask. He left, and I sat alone on the terrace, staring at the untouched soup, my mind racing. Antonio Rossini, the man I had been taught to hate, had just offered me the one thing I'd wanted for 5 long years. Answers. And the price for those answers, I suspected, was going to be far higher than $5,000. Elena drove me home in silence, walking me to my apartment door with the same detached professionalism she'd displayed all evening. But before she left, she handed me a phone, sleek and new, with only one number programmed into it. Mr. Rossini's private line, she explained. If you decide you want to know the truth, call. If you don't, destroy the phone. Either way, you're now under his protection. Anyone who comes after you answers to him. She left before I could even ask what that meant, what protection from Antonio Rossini really entailed, and whether being under his protection was really any different from being his prisoner. I locked my door, checked the locks not twice, but 3 times, and then sat down on my futon, holding the phone tightly in my hand. Antonio Rossini's final words kept echoing in my mind. I want to see you dangerous. God help me. Part of me wanted that, too. The phone sat on my kitchen counter for 6 days, untouched, but ever-present, like a loaded gun that someone had casually left in my apartment. I circled it during my morning coffee, avoided it when I came home from my shifts at Billionaire, and stared at it during those long, sleepless 3 a.m. hours when my brain simply refused to stop replaying Antonio Rossini's words. The truth about your father. All you have to do is ask. But asking meant acknowledging that I actually wanted to know. It meant opening a door that I had kept firmly closed for 5 years. It meant accepting that the tidy narrative I had built around my father's death, tragic but comprehensible, might be nothing but a lie. It meant stepping even further into Rossini's dangerous world. And I already felt like I was drowning in obligations I didn't even understand. Work became my refuge, the familiar chaos of the restaurant offering a temporary escape from the impossible choice that was waiting for me at home. Maria noticed my distraction, commenting that I seemed even more checked out than usual, and Tommy kept offering to set me up with his cousin who worked in construction, as if a boyfriend would somehow magically solve all of my problems. I just smiled and deflected, focusing on the mundane tasks that kept my hands busy and my mind occupied. It was Wednesday afternoon, my rare day off, when everything suddenly changed. I'd spent the morning at the hospital with my mother, who was showing remarkable improvement. Her doctors were cautiously optimistic about her response to the treatment. She had been clear-headed enough to press me about my life, asking about friends and dating and whether I was taking care of myself, questions that I deflected with practiced ease before pleading exhaustion and leaving earlier than usual. I was walking to the subway station, completely lost in thought, when a hand grabbed my arm and yanked me into a dark alley. I screamed, or at least tried to, but another hand clamped firmly over my mouth, and I was shoved against a brick wall with enough force to knock the breath right out of my lungs. 2 men, both in cheap suits that screamed of trying too hard, one holding me while the other blocked the entrance to the alley. Ava Morrison, the one holding me, said, his breath reeking of cigarettes and cheap coffee, "We need to have a conversation." Terror flooded my system, sharp and immediate. These weren't Rossini's men. I knew that instinctively. His people wore better suits, carried themselves with far more confidence, and wouldn't be this crude or obvious. These were someone else's thugs, which made them infinitely more dangerous. "Who are you?" I managed to ask when he removed his hand from my mouth, my voice shaking but still functional. We represent interested parties, the man said vaguely. Parties who are curious about your relationship with Antonio Rossini. You've been seen with him, been to his house, been on the receiving end of his generosity. That makes people nervous, sweetheart. Makes them think you might be more important than you appear to be. I'm not important, I said quickly, desperately. I'm just a waitress. I don't know anything. See, that's where you're wrong. The second man chimed in from his position at the alley entrance. You know Rossini personally. You have access to him. That makes you very interesting to us. I don't have access to anything, I insisted, trying to pull away, but the grip on my arms only tightened, hard enough to leave bruises. I served him dinner once. That's it. Liar, the first man hissed, slamming me against the wall again. Stars burst behind my eyes. We've been watching you. We know he sent a car for you. We know you spent 3 hours at his estate. We know he's had his people protecting you. You're something to him, which means you're valuable to us. I'm not, I started to say, but he cut me off. Here's how this works, he said, his face inches from mine. You're going to feed us information about Rossini. His schedule, his meetings, his weaknesses. And if you're very cooperative, we might not kill your sick mother to motivate you. The threat to my mother ignited something primal within me, that fire that Rossini had talked about. I brought my knee up hard into the man's groin. I broke free when his grip loosened, and then I ran. I didn't make it very far. The second man caught me before I reached the street, dragging me back into the alley. Then a fist connected with my face, and the world exploded in a blinding flash of pain. I hit the ground hard, tasting blood, my vision swimming. Through the haze, I saw the first man advancing toward me, fury etched into his features. I saw his foot draw back for a kick, and I knew with absolute clarity that I was about to be beaten to death in a dark alley while people walked by just 50 feet away, completely oblivious to what was happening. Then, a gunshot cracked through the air, deafening in the enclosed space. The first man dropped instantly, a red bloom spreading rapidly across his chest. The second man reached for a gun, but another shot rang out, and he fell too, his weapon clattering uselessly to the pavement. I scrambled backward, my back hitting the brick wall, completely unable to process what had just happened. 2 men stood at the alley entrance, both wearing the crisp suits and displaying the focused demeanor that I had come to associate with Rossini's people. One still had his gun drawn, the suppressor explaining why the shots hadn't been as loud as they should have been. The other was already on his phone, speaking rapidly in Italian. Miss Morrison, the one with the gun said, holstering his weapon and approaching me with his hands raised in a non-threatening manner. Are you injured? Can you stand? I tried to answer, but all that came out was a sob, shock finally catching up with me. He crouched down to my level, his expression professionally concerned rather than emotionally invested. We need to get you out of here. Can you walk? They threatened my mother. I managed to choke out, my voice raw. They said. We know, he interrupted gently. Don't worry about your mother. She's already been secured. Mr. Rossini anticipated this possibility. Of course he had, because Antonio Rossini thought 3 steps ahead, saw potential threats before they even materialized, and apparently had been having me protected without my knowledge. The realization should have been comforting, but instead, it felt like just another manipulation, another way he was controlling my life without my permission. The man helped me to my feet, steadying me when my legs threatened to buckle beneath me. The second man had finished his call and was pulling a black SUV into the alley, completely unconcerned about the 2 bodies bleeding out on the pavement. I was guided into the back seat. Someone pressed something cold to my swelling face. And then we were moving, leaving the alley and the dead men and any pretense of my normal life far behind. We drove north again, along the familiar route to Rossini's estate. I should have protested, should have demanded that they take me home, but my head was pounding, my face throbbed with pain, and I was simply too tired, too overwhelmed, to fight anymore. When we arrived at the mansion, Elena was waiting at the entrance, her expression actually showing concern for the first time since I had met her. Mr. Rossini is in the study, she said to the men, then turned to me. Come, Miss Morrison. Let's get you cleaned up. I followed her through the house to a bathroom that was larger than my entire apartment, where she efficiently assessed my injuries with the practiced touch of someone with medical training. My cheekbone was bruised, but not broken. My lip was split, but wouldn't require stitches, and my ribs ached, but seemed to be intact. She cleaned the blood from my face with gentle efficiency, applied an antiseptic that stung like hell, and gave me 2 pain pills with a glass of water. Mr. Rossini would like to speak with you when you're ready, she said, her tone making it clear that when you're ready was a polite fiction for right now. I found him in a room lined with books. Expensive, leather-bound volumes that probably included first editions worth more than my entire life. He stood by a window overlooking the grounds, a glass of scotch in his hand, his posture rigid with barely controlled fury. He turned when I entered, and the expression on his face was almost frightening in its intensity. Ava, he said, crossing the room in 3 long strides, his hands reaching for my face before he caught himself, dropping them back down to his sides. Christo, look what they did to you. They threatened my mother, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. They wanted me to spy on you. I know, he said, and something in his tone told me that he really did know. He probably had known about it even before it happened. They were Lorenzo Salvatore's men. He's been trying to move into my territory for months, looking for weaknesses, for leverage. He thought you were that leverage. Was he wrong? I asked, meeting those unnerving obsidian eyes despite the fear and confusion swirling in my chest. Am I leverage against you? Rossini's jaw tightened, a muscle ticking visibly beneath his skin. You're under my protection. That makes you untouchable. Salvatore just learned that lesson. Permanently. You killed them, I said, the full reality of it finally sinking in. Your men shot them in an alley in broad daylight. I protected you, he corrected. And I'll keep protecting you as long as you're connected to me, which means Salvatore will try again. He won't stop until he sends a message, until he's proven that he can reach my people. I'm not your people, I protested weakly, but we both knew that it was a lie. The moment I had accepted his money, maybe even the moment he had first noticed me at the restaurant, I had become his whether I wanted to be or not. Your mother is being moved to a private facility, Rossini said, changing the subject with the easy authority of someone who was used to making decisions for other people. Top-level security, the best doctors that money can buy, and protection that will keep Salvatore or anyone else from touching her. I can't afford that. It's not a request. Ava, he interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. Your mother stays where she is. She's a target. Salvatore will use her to get to you. Use you to get to me. This is the only way to keep her safe. And what about me? I demanded, anger finally breaking through the shock. Where do I go to be safe? Back to my apartment where apparently anyone can just grab me off the street? Back to the restaurant where God knows who is watching my every move. You stay here, he said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. You stay where I can protect you personally. The suggestion, or rather the command, made me laugh, a slightly hysterical sound that echoed in the book-lined room. Stay here, live with you in your house, like a mistress or a prisoner or, what exactly? Like someone whose life is in danger, he said, his voice dropping to that dangerously quiet tone that somehow demanded attention. Like someone who needs protection that only I can provide. Like someone who should have called me the moment Salvatore's men approached instead of trying to handle it alone. I didn't know, I said, exhaustion replacing my anger. I didn't know that there were other players, other families, other threats. I just wanted to survive. And now, survival means accepting my help, Rossini said, moving closer until I could smell his cologne. Cedar and something darker, something more dangerous. It means staying here where my security can keep you safe. It means trusting me. You want me to trust the man who runs the organization that killed my father? I asked bitterly. I want you to trust the man who just saved your life, he corrected. And I'm still offering you the truth about your father, if you're ready to hear it. The truth. Everything came back to the truth. It was dangled like a tempting bait that I was simply too desperate not to take. Tell me, I said. my voice barely above a whisper. Tell me who really killed my father and why. Rossini studied me for a long moment, as if he was assessing whether I could handle what he was about to reveal. Then, he walked over to his desk, pulled out a file folder thick with documents and photographs, and set it down on the table between us. Your father wasn't investigating a drug deal, he began, his voice taking on the cadence of someone recounting well-established facts. He was investigating a money laundering scheme that involved 3 city councilmen, 2 judges, a deputy commissioner, and the head of the Longshoremen's Union. The operation moved $40 million a year through the ports, cleaned it through legitimate businesses, and distributed it to keep our entire political structure compromised. He opened the folder and showed me photographs of men I recognized from news broadcasts, from my father's study, and from the funeral where they had offered their sympathies with false sincerity. Your father compiled evidence, Rossini continued. He built a case that would have brought down half of the city's leadership. And when the people involved realized how close he was, they simply couldn't let him live. So, they set up the warehouse ambush, made it look like a drug deal gone wrong, and buried the investigation before it could expose them. But why? I asked, my hands trembling as I looked at the photographs. Why tell me this? Why keep evidence of something that could destroy you, too? Because I wasn't part of it, he said, his eyes intense, demanding that I believe him. My father was? Yes. The old guard made those deals, built those relationships. But when I took over 3 years ago, a while back, I made the call to sever ties with those corrupt officials, started streamlining our operations, basically cleaning house and making everything above board. Now, the guys who offed your father, they see me as a real problem too. So, we've got a common enemy, I said, drawing out the words, letting the realization sink in. You want me to help you take them down? I want you to get the justice you deserve, he corrected, his voice firm. And I need you to understand that the man you've been taught to hate, the monster you see in your nightmares, he wasn't the one who took your father from you. I just about collapsed into a nearby chair, my head swimming. Everything I had believed for the last 5 years was suddenly in question. How do I even know you're telling the truth? I asked, my voice laced with suspicion. How do I know this isn't just another manipulation? Rossini knelt down in front of me, bringing himself to my eye level. His expression was more open, more vulnerable than I had ever seen it. You don't, he admitted, his gaze steady. You just have to take a leap of faith, or you don't. But either way, Ava, you're staying right here until Salvatore is taken care of. Your safety? That's non-negotiable. Nothing is negotiable with you, is it? I said, the words lacking any real bite, just filled with exhaustion and a sense of resignation. No, he agreed, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. I don't negotiate. I decide what needs to be done and I do it. It's what's kept me alive in this world where hesitation is a death sentence. Must be nice, I muttered, laced with sarcasm. Having that kind of certainty. It's lonely, he said so softly that I almost didn't catch it. Making every decision on your own, trusting absolutely no one, knowing that affection is just a weapon people use against you. He stood up then and offered me his hand. But you're not alone anymore, Ava. For better or worse, you're mine to protect now. I stared at his outstretched hand, knowing that taking it meant accepting everything that came along with it. His protection, his world, his version of the truth. But my face ached. My mother was being moved to a secure facility without my permission, and 2 men had died because of me that very day. Did I really even have a choice? I took his hand, and Antonio Rossini smiled like he had just won something incredibly valuable. Elalina appeared then to show me to what I guessed would be my room. It turned out to be a suite that was bigger than my entire apartment, complete with a canopy bed, an ensuite bathroom, and a view of the gardens that would have been beautiful if I wasn't essentially a prisoner. She laid out some fresh clothes for me, told me that dinner would be served at 8, and then left me alone with my thoughts and the file folder Rini had given me to read. I sat on the edge of the impossibly soft bed, opened the folder, and began to read about how my father had died. And with each page that I turned, the anger that Rini wanted to see inside me finally began to burn. The first week at Antonio Rossini's estate just sort of blurred by. It felt like time was moving both too fast and impossibly slow, all at the same time. I existed in this in-between state, not quite a prisoner, but definitely not a guest, just sort of existing on the fringes of a world that I never wanted to understand. My suite became my gilded cage, where I spent hours reading and rereading the file on my father's death, memorizing names and faces, tracing connections that led to people who still held power, who were still walking free while my father was rotting in the ground. Elena maintained her professional distance. She would appear 3 times a day with meals that I barely touched, laying out clothes that I didn't ask for, and reminding me of the estate's rules with a polite but firm tone. I wasn't allowed to leave the grounds unless I had an escort. I wasn't allowed to contact anyone from my old life without explicit approval. And I wasn't allowed anywhere near the East Wing, where Rini conducted all of his business. For your own safety, of course, she assured me, as if imprisonment could ever be presented as a form of protection. Antonio himself was largely absent those first few days. I'd only catch glimpses of him in passing as he moved through the house with his security detail, always on phone calls in rapid-fire Italian, always radiating that controlled intensity that suggested violence was kept barely in check. Whenever we did cross paths, he would pause, those dark eyes assessing me with an attention that felt invasive before he would just continue on without saying a word. I should have been relieved by his absence. Instead, I found myself hyper-aware of his presence in the house, tracking his movements through overheard conversations and the tension that preceded him, like a weather front before a storm. My mother called on the 4th day. Her voice was bright with medicated cheerfulness, clearly a result of whatever painkillers the new facility was giving her. She gushed about her private room, about the attentive nurses, and the view of a garden where she could sit whenever she felt strong enough. She assumed that I had somehow managed to secure better insurance for her or that the hospital had taken pity on her case, and I just let her believe the comfortable lies because the truth would have absolutely destroyed her. "You sound tired, sweetie," she said, some maternal concern breaking through the drug-induced haze. "Are you taking care of yourself? Eating enough? Getting enough rest?" "I'm fine, Mom," I assured her, staring out at the manicured grounds that stretched all the way to the treeline. "I just picked up some extra shifts at work, saving up some money." More lies, and they were getting easier to tell each time. I was building an entire architecture of deception that was starting to feel more real than the truth. We talked for 20 minutes before exhaustion finally claimed her. Her words began to slur as the medication pulled her back under. I sat there with the phone pressed to my ear long after the call had ended, just listening to the silence. I was really feeling the distance between who I had been and who I was quickly becoming. It was on the 8th night when everything shifted. I was in the library, Rini's file spread out all over the massive oak desk, making notes on a legal pad, trying to organize the information into something coherent, when I felt his presence behind me. I didn't turn around, didn't even acknowledge him. I just kept writing, determined not to show him how his being close to me was affecting my pulse rate. "You've been studying," he observed, moving around the desk to see what I'd written. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, revealing his muscular forearms, and his hair was slightly disheveled, as if he'd been running his hands through it. It was evidence of his humanity that somehow just made him seem more dangerous, not less. "Just trying to make some sense of all of this," I said, gesturing to my notes. "The connections are definitely there, but I don't understand the larger structure. Why these specific officials? Why this particular scheme?" Rini pulled up a chair, sitting close enough that I could smell his cologne, and he began to explain everything. His voice was patient, almost professorial, as he walked me through the intricacies of money laundering, political corruption, and organized crime, and the infiltration of legitimate government. He sketched diagrams on my legal pad, his handwriting surprisingly elegant, showing me how money flowed through shell companies and non-profit organizations, how favors were exchanged and debts accumulated, how an entire system of control had been built through financial interdependence. "Your father understood all of this," Rossini said, tapping one of the photographs. "He saw the whole machine, not just the individual parts. That's why they killed him. He wasn't just investigating crimes. He was threatening to expose an entire ecosystem that had taken decades to build. "And you're part of that ecosystem," I said, meeting his eyes directly. "Even if you didn't kill him yourself, you still benefit from the structure that did." "Yes," he admitted without any hesitation. "I was born into this world, Ava, raised to take over my father's empire, taught that power was the only thing that mattered. I can't change my past. I can't undo the things that were done before I had any control. But I can choose what I do with the power that I have now." "And what do you choose?" I asked, genuinely curious despite my deep distrust. "I choose to be different than my father," he said, his expression revealing a glimpse of something deeper, more complex than the monster I had imagined. "I choose to build something that doesn't require corruption and violence to sustain itself. And I choose to give you justice for your father if you'll let me." Before I could even respond, his phone buzzed with that particular tone that I had learned meant urgent business. He glanced at it, his expression hardening before he stood up abruptly. "I need to handle something. Don't wait up." And then he just left, and I sat alone in the library, surrounded by all the evidence of my father's murder and the growing realization that Antonio Rossini was way more complicated than the simple villain I had needed him to be. The hatred that had sustained me for the last 5 years was starting to develop cracks, letting in uncomfortable truths that just didn't fit the narrative I had so carefully constructed. I was still in the library 2 hours later when I heard the gunshots. They weren't close, but they weren't far enough away to ignore either. Sharp cracks echoed across the grounds, followed by shouting in Italian. My heart started hammering in my chest as I moved to the window. I could see figures running through the darkness, and the flash of more gunfire near the perimeter wall. Elena burst through the door, her usually composed demeanor completely fractured by urgency. "Miss Morrison, we need to move you to the safe room now." "What's going on?" I demanded even as she grabbed my arm, pulling me toward a bookshelf that swung open to reveal a hidden passage. "Lorenzo Salvatore's people," she said tersely, guiding me down a narrow staircase. "They're attacking the estate." Mr. Rossini anticipated this possibility, which is why we have protocols in place. The safe room was exactly what it sounded like. A reinforced bunker beneath the house, complete with monitors showing security camera feeds, stockpiled supplies, and enough weapons to outfit a small army. Elena locked the door behind us, checked the monitors, and then handed me a gun. A compact 9mm that felt heavy and familiar in my hand. My father had taught me how to shoot. He made sure I knew how to handle firearms before I was even 10 years old. "Do you know how to use this?" Elena asked, and I nodded, checking the magazine automatically, chambering around with practiced efficiency. Her expression shifted slightly, revealing a hint of approval. "Good. Stay here. Stay quiet. And if anyone comes through that door who isn't me or Mr. Rossini, shoot them." And then she left through a second exit that I hadn't even noticed, leaving me alone with the monitors and the distant sounds of violence. I watched the security feeds, seeing Rini's men engaging with the invaders, witnessing the organized chaos of a coordinated assault. And then I saw him. Antonio Rossini was right there in the center of it, directing his people with hand signals, returning fire with the cold precision of someone who'd done this before, who had been born into violence and learned to wield it like an instrument. I watched him take down 2 men who had breached the main house. I watched him move through his home with lethal efficiency and understood, viscerally, why people were so afraid of him. This wasn't the refined art collector who had explained financial crimes to me in the library. This was the killer, the mafia boss, the man who had built an empire on blood and intimidation. The assault lasted for 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. When the gunfire finally stopped, I counted 6 bodies on the monitors, all wearing Salvatore's colors, all either dead or dying on Rossini's manicured lawn. His men moved through the aftermath with grim efficiency, removing evidence, securing the perimeter, and treating the whole thing like the routine business it probably was for them. Elena returned 30 minutes later, her dress somehow still immaculate despite whatever she had been doing. "It's over. Mr. Rossini wants to see you." I followed her back upstairs, my legs shaking from the adrenaline crash, still holding the gun because I had forgotten to put it down. We found Rini in his study. His shirt was torn and blood-stained, and he had a cut above his eyebrow that was dripping blood down his face. He was on the phone, speaking in clipped Italian, while a medic tried to clean his wounds. He waved the medic away when he saw me, ending his call abruptly. "You're okay," he said, and it wasn't a question. It was more like he was confirming a fact that he just needed to be true. "They attacked your home," I said, still trying to process what I had witnessed. "They tried to kill you." "They tried," he agreed, accepting a towel from Elena and pressing it to his forehead. "They failed. 6 dead, 2 captured for questioning, and Salvatore just declared war. Which means things are going to get worse before they get better." "Because of me?" I said, the guilt hitting me like a physical blow. "He's coming after you because he thinks I'm your weakness." "You're not my weakness," Rini said, his voice hard. "You're under my protection, which makes you untouchable. Salvatore attacking here, is all about power and territory and a dozen other things that have absolutely nothing to do with you personally. You're just the excuse he's using." "That's supposed to make me feel better?" I asked, the fear starting to be replaced by anger. 6 men died tonight. Your home was violated. All because you decided that I was worth protecting." "Yes," he said simply, standing up despite the medic's protests. "And I'd do it again. I kill 100 men to keep you safe. Ava, 1,000, however many it takes." The intensity of his declaration stunned me into silence. He crossed the room, stopping close enough that I could see the blood still trickling from the cut on his face, and I could see the absolute certainty in his eyes that what he was saying was the truth. "Why?" I whispered. "Why me? I'm nobody, just a waitress whose father you barely knew. Why risk everything for me?" "Because the moment I saw you at Bella, completely ignoring me with that perfect, disdainful indifference, I just knew you were different," he said, his hand coming up to cup my face with surprising gentleness. "Because you walked into that VIP room carrying hatred and fear and exhaustion, and you still had the courage to look me right in the eye. Because you're Thomas Morrison's daughter, and you deserved better than the hand life dealt you." "That's not an answer," I said, but my voice was shaking. My body was responding to his proximity in ways that my mind was insisting were wrong. "Because I want you," he said, his thumb brushing my cheekbone. "I want your fire, your strength, your absolute refusal to be broken. I want to see you dangerous, remember? I want to watch you burn down the world that took your father from you." "I don't want to be wanted by you," I said, but it sounded weak even to my own ears because something deep inside me did want it. I wanted to be seen and valued and protected with the kind of absolute commitment that he was offering. "Liar," he said softly, his face moving closer to mine. "You can hate what I am, hate what I represent, hate everything about this entire situation, but you can't deny that you feel it too. This pull between us." He was right. God help me, he was right. Somewhere between reading the file on my father and the attack tonight, between his explanations in the library and watching him defend his home, my hatred had become complicated by attraction, by grudging respect, and by the seductive promise of someone who would burn the entire world down just to keep me safe. "This is insane," I breathed, but I didn't pull away when he leaned in. I didn't stop him when his lips met mine in a kiss that was both gentle and demanding, and tasted of blood and whiskey and terrible decisions. The kiss only lasted for a few seconds before reality crashed back down on me, and I jerked away, my hand coming up to touch my lips, shock and shame and unwanted desire warring in my chest. "I can't. We can't. I'm what?" he challenged. "A criminal? A killer? The man you thought murdered your father." "All true, Ava. But I'm also the man standing between you and every single threat in this city. I'm the man who's going to help you get justice. And I'm the man who just kissed you, and you kissed me back. One kiss doesn't mean anything," I insisted, desperate to reestablish the boundaries that had just been completely demolished. "It means everything," he countered. "It means you've stopped seeing me as just a monster. It means you're starting to see the man underneath all of it, and it terrifies you, which is exactly why you're pushing back so hard." He was right again, and I hated him for it. I hated him for being so perceptive and patient and willing to wait while I processed all these feelings that I didn't even want to have. "I need some time," I said finally. "I need to think." "Take all the time you need," he said, stepping back and giving me the space that I wasn't even sure I really wanted. "But know this, Ava. You're staying here in my home, under my protection, until Salvatore is dealt with. And every single day that you stay, you're going to see more of who I really am. You'll see the good and the bad, the violence and the gentleness, the monster and the man. And then you'll decide." "Decide what?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. "Whether you want to just walk away when all of this is finally over," he said, his eyes holding mine. "Or whether you want to stay with me and burn the whole world down together." Elalina appeared at the door, clearing her throat discreetly. "Sir, the prisoners are ready for interrogation." Rossini's expression shifted instantly, the gentleness vanishing, replaced by cold calculation. "I'll be there momentarily." He looked back at me, and his voice softened again. "Go to your room, Ava. Get some rest. We'll talk more about this tomorrow." I fled, grateful for the escape, and spent the rest of the night in my suite, touching my lips where he had kissed me, staring up at the ceiling and wondering exactly when I had stopped seeing Antonio Rossini as my enemy and started seeing him as something far more dangerous. A man I could actually fall for. Somewhere in the East Wing, I just knew he was interrogating the captured men, probably using methods that I didn't even want to imagine, being the monster he had admitted to being. But in my memory, I just kept replaying the gentleness of his touch, the certainty in his voice when he had promised to protect me, the way that he had looked at me, like I was something precious rather than just another problem that needed to be solved. I finally fell asleep just before dawn, completely exhausted and confused, and frighteningly aware that I was crossing lines that I couldn't possibly uncross, and making choices that would change absolutely everything. And when I woke up just hours later to find a single red rose on my nightstand with a note that simply said, "Good morning," in Antonio's elegant script, I realized that the siege wasn't just Salvatore attacking the estate. It was Antonio Rossini systematically dismantling every single defense that I had against him, and I was actually starting to let him do it. The rose stayed right there on my nightstand for 3 days, slowly wilting. Its petals were dropping one by one onto the polished wood surface. I just couldn't bring myself to throw it away. I couldn't stop myself from touching the note with its elegant script. I couldn't stop thinking about that kiss that had shattered my carefully constructed worldview. Antonio had given me space after that night, maintaining a respectful distance while simultaneously making his presence felt in 1,000 small ways. Fresh flowers started appearing in my suite each morning. Books on art and history were left right by my door, with certain passages marked for my attention. Dinner invitations were delivered by Elena, with the clear understanding that I could refuse without any consequence. I refused the first 2 dinners, eating alone in my room like some sullen teenager, but I accepted the third because curiosity and isolation were slowly driving me absolutely insane. I found him in a private dining room that I hadn't even known existed. It was smaller and way more intimate than the formal spaces I had seen before, with a table that was set for 2 and candles that cast dancing shadows on the walls. He stood up when I walked in, wearing dark slacks and a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my monthly rent used to be. He looked more relaxed than I had ever seen him. "Thank you for coming," he said, pulling out my chair with old-world courtesy that felt so anachronistic coming from a man that I had literally watched kill people on the security monitors. "I wasn't sure that you would. I was hungry," I said, the lie hanging transparently between us. "And I was just tired of eating all alone." "Of course," he agreed, that slight smile playing on his lips. It was the one that said that he totally saw right through me but was enough of a gentleman not to call me out on it. Hunger is a perfectly reasonable motivation. Dinner was surprisingly comfortable. The conversation just flowed way easier than it should have between a mafia boss and the daughter of the cop who had tried to bring down his entire organization. We talked about art, about the books he had left for me, and about his travels through Europe acquiring pieces for his collection. He was educated, well-read, and cultured in ways that completely contradicted everything that I had expected. and I found myself actually laughing at his stories, just forgetting for long stretches of time exactly who and what he really was. "You're not what I expected," I admitted over dessert. "A tiramisu that just melted on my tongue like a dream. When I thought about you before, you were just this monster, this faceless evil that was responsible for absolutely everything that was wrong in my life. And now?" he asked, his dark eyes intense over the rim of his wine glass. "Now you're complicated," I said honestly, which is somehow even worse because monsters are easy to hate. But complicated people with good qualities and terrible choices are just much harder to categorize. "Life would be simpler if we were all purely good or purely evil," he agreed. "But we're just people, Ava. We're just making decisions based on the circumstances that we're born into, just trying to survive in a world that doesn't offer any clean choices." "That sounds like justification," I challenged. "Like you're excusing all the violence, all the crime, and all the hurt that you cause." "I'm not excusing anything," he said, setting down his glass. "I know exactly what I am and exactly what I've done. I carry that weight every single day. But I also know that in my world, mercy is often mistaken for weakness. And weakness will get you killed. So I just choose strength, even when it requires me to be ruthless." "Doesn't it just exhaust you?" I asked. "Always having to be the hardest person in the room. Always having to prove that you're not weak." Something flickered across his face then. A vulnerability that was quickly masked. "Yes," he admitted. "It's exhausting, which is exactly why moments like this, sitting here with someone who sees me as a person rather than just a role to play, are so incredibly precious." The honesty disarmed me, and it made me want to reach across the table and take his hand, and offer him a comfort that I had absolutely no business providing. Instead, I changed the subject and I asked him about his childhood, about his family, and the path that had led him to inherit an empire that he claimed he wanted to change. He answered with surprising openness, painting a vivid picture of a boyhood that was spent learning violence and strategy, of a father who had valued strength over kindness, and of a mother who had died when he was only 12 and taken with her any softness that he might have ever developed. We talked until past midnight, until the candles had burned low, and Elena appeared to clear the dishes with a knowing look that I just chose to completely ignore. Antonio walked me back to my suite, maintaining a very careful distance, not pushing for any more than I was ready to give. At my door, he paused, his hand coming up to brush a strand of hair away from my face. "Thank you for tonight," he said softly. "Thank you for giving me a chance to be more than just what you expected." "Thank you for being more," I replied. And then, because I was just so tired of fighting what I was actually feeling, I stood up on my toes and kissed his cheek, letting. My lips lingered for just a moment before pulling back. As I retreated, his hand snared mine, his fingers lacing through mine, his eyes searching my face intently. "Ava," he began, but I cut him off with a shake of my head. "Don't," I pleaded. "Don't ask me what this means, or where we're going, or any of the questions I don't have answers to. Just let it be what it is for now." "And what is it?" he asked, his thumb stroking across my knuckles, that gentle caress sending goosebumps racing up my arm. "Complicated," I said, echoing my earlier assessment. "Everything about this is complicated." He raised my hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to my palm that felt more intimate than it had any right to be, before finally releasing me. "Complicated I can work with. It's indifference I couldn't handle." I slipped into my room before I could do something foolish like invite him in, leaning against the closed door and touching my palm where his lips had been. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, with no idea how far the fall would be. The next morning, everything shifted again, the ground moving beneath my feet. I was having breakfast in the conservatory, soaking up the morning sun and actually feeling something that almost resembled peace, when Antonio appeared with an expression that made my stomach plummet. He was in full business mode, clad in a dark suit, his eyes like chips of ice. The gentle man from the previous night was gone, replaced by the ruthless crime boss I'd only seen on security monitors. "We need to talk," he said, diving right in, no preamble necessary. He sat down across from me, his body coiled with barely restrained tension. I received intelligence about Salvatore's next move. He's planning something big. Something that targets you specifically. Fear shot through me like a jolt of electricity. What kind of something? He's learned about your mother's new facility, Antonio said, his voice controlled but barely masking the rage simmering beneath the surface. He's planning to take her, use her as bait to draw you out, to force me to negotiate from a position of weakness. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. When? We're not sure yet. My people are working on getting more information. But we can't wait for him to act. We need to make the first move. Strike before he has a chance to put his plan into motion. What does that mean? I asked, though I already knew the answer was going to be steeped in violence. It means I'm going to end Lorenzo Salvatore, Antonio said flatly, the words carrying the weight of finality. Tonight. And I need you to trust that I can keep your mother safe while I do it. You're going to kill him, I stated, the reality of it stark and undeniable. You're going to start a war. The war already started when he attacked my home. Antonio corrected, his gaze unwavering. I'm just going to end it permanently. I should have been horrified. I should have protested, desperately searching for some solution that didn't involve more death. But all I felt was a cold, calculating pragmatism settling over me. The same ruthless mindset my father had tried to instill in me. Salvatore was a threat to my mother, to me, to any chance of peace. Eliminating him was logical, necessary even, regardless of the moral cost. What do you need from me? I asked, and something that resembled approval flickered in Antonio's eyes. I need you to stay here, stay safe, and trust that I'm going to handle this, he said. I need you not to worry about me, or try to follow me, or do anything that puts you at risk. Can you do that? Do I have a choice? There's always a choice, he said, reaching across the table to take my hand. But I'm hoping you'll choose to trust me. I looked at our joined hands, at the stark contrast between his scarred knuckles and my smooth fingers, and made a decision that would have horrified the woman I'd been just 3 weeks ago. I trust you, I said. Do what you need to do. He squeezed my hand, then stood, already shifting back into the role that demanded he be ruthless, cold, and probably terrible. I'll be back by morning, he promised. And when I return, Salvatore won't be a threat anymore. Antonio, I called as he reached the door, using his first name deliberately, intimately. Come back safe. His expression softened for just a moment, the mask slipping to reveal the man underneath. Always, he said, and then he was gone, taking half his security force with him and leaving me in the mansion with Elena and the remaining guards. The waiting was torture. I paced my suite, unable to focus on reading, or television, or anything that required sustained attention. Elena brought dinner that I couldn't eat, tea that went cold while I stared out the window at the darkening grounds. Hours crawled by, each minute an eternity, and I found myself praying to a God I hadn't spoken to since my father's funeral, bargaining for Antonio's safety in exchange for promises I wasn't sure I could keep. It was just past 3 a.m. when I heard vehicles approaching, the unmistakable sound of the SUVs returning. I ran down the stairs in my nightgown, not caring about propriety or appearances, desperate to see that he was alive. Elena tried to stop me, but I pushed past her, bursting through the front door just as Antonio stepped out of the lead vehicle. He was covered in blood, his suit ruined, his face spattered with crimson that definitely wasn't his, judging by the way he was moving. But he was alive, whole, and when he saw me standing on the steps, his exhausted expression transformed into something that looked almost like joy. Ava, he said, and then I was running to him, throwing my arms around him despite the blood, despite the guards watching, despite every reason this was a terrible idea. He caught me, his arms wrapping around me with crushing strength, his face buried in my hair. You're alive? I sobbed, surprising myself with tears I hadn't known I was capable of crying. You came back. I promised, he said, pulling back just enough to look at me, his hands cupping my face. I will always come back to you. And then he was kissing me and I was kissing him back, and nothing else mattered except the fact that he was alive and I was alive and the threat that had hung over us was gone. His lips were demanding, possessive, claiming me in front of his men, and Elena, and God, and anyone else who might be watching. And I let him because I wanted to be claimed, wanted to be his in ways I couldn't fully articulate. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against mine. "It's done," he said quietly. "Salvatore is dead. His organization will fracture without him, and my people will absorb what's left. You're safe now. Your mother is safe. It's over." "What did it cost?" I asked, seeing the exhaustion etched into his eyes, the weight of whatever he'd done that night. "Nothing I wasn't willing to pay," he said, but I could see the lie in his expression, could see that it had cost him something, maybe a piece of his soul he'd never get back. I took his hand, bloody and scarred, and led him inside, up the stairs to his suite rather than mine, because he needed care and I needed to provide it. Elena tried to follow, but I shook my head, closing the door on her concerned expression. "Let me help," I said, guiding him to the bathroom, starting the shower, helping him out of his ruined clothes with a clinical efficiency that masked how deeply affected I was by his body, by the scars that mapped a life of violence, by the trust he was showing in letting me see him vulnerable. We showered together, not sexual despite our nudity, just washing away the blood and the fear and the weight of the night. I was gentle as I cleaned him, and he was pliant under my hands, letting me care for him in ways I suspected he rarely allowed anyone to do. When we were clean and dry, I led him to his bed, enormous and covered in expensive linens, and we lay down together, his arms around me, my head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat slow from combat speed to something approaching normal. "I killed 7 men tonight," he said into the darkness, his voice raw. 7 men who had families, who had lives, who I ended because they stood between me and keeping you safe. "I know," I said, "because there was no point in pretending otherwise. And I should be horrified, should want nothing to do with you because of it. But all I feel is grateful that you're willing to do terrible things to protect me. That makes you as much a monster as me," he said. But there was no judgment in his voice, just exhausted honesty. "Maybe," I agreed, "or maybe it just makes me practical. We don't get to choose our circumstances, Antonio. We only get to choose how we respond to them." He held me tighter, and we fell asleep tangled together, crossing a line I couldn't uncross, becoming complicit in his violence, accepting protection purchased with blood. When I woke hours later to find him watching me with an expression that looked almost like reverence, I knew that whatever we were becoming, whatever this was between us, there was no going back to the woman I'd been before. "What are you thinking?" I asked, my voice rough with sleep. "That you're the most dangerous thing that's ever happened to me?" he said, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "That I'd burn down the world to keep you, that I'm falling in love with you, and it terrifies me. I should have run, should have been scared, should have protected myself from the vulnerability he was offering. Instead, I kissed him, slow and deep and full of promise, and whispered against his lips, 'Then let's be dangerous together, and God help us both.' I meant it." 3 weeks after Lorenzo Salvatore's death, I stood in Antonio's study, watching him negotiate the terms of a territorial agreement with 2 rival families who'd been circling like sharks since the power vacuum opened. He spoke in rapid Italian, his voice carrying that particular edge that meant he was done negotiating and ready to simply dictate terms. The men across from him, hardened criminals who'd probably killed more people than I could imagine, shifted uncomfortably under his cold stare, recognizing that Antonio Ruzzini wasn't interested in compromise. I understood about 40% of what was being said, enough to follow the broad strokes, if not the nuances. My Italian had improved dramatically in the weeks I'd spent at the estate, partly from Antonio's patient tutoring during our evenings together, partly from necessity as I became more integrated into his world. Elena had stopped treating me like a temporary guest and started including me in household decisions, asking my opinion on menus and staff schedules with the casual deference she'd show the lady of the house. Because that's what I was becoming, wasn't it? The slow creep of domesticity had woven itself through our days. Breakfast together when his schedule allowed, stolen moments in his study while he worked, nights spent in his bed where we talked and made love and built something that looked disturbingly like a relationship. I'd stopped thinking about my studio apartment in Queens, stopped mourning the loss of my independence, stopped questioning whether I'd made terrible choices. The meeting concluded with handshakes and thinly veiled threats, the rival families agreeing to Antonio's terms because the alternative was a war they couldn't win. When they left, escorted out by his security, Antonio turned to me, exhaustion etched into his features. These past weeks had been brutal, consolidating power, eliminating threats, restructuring his organization to fill the void Salvatore had left. I'd watched him carry the weight of it all, seeing the toll it took even as he refused to show weakness. "Come here," he said, and I went to him, settling into his lap in the massive leather chair, his arms coming around me with the familiar possessiveness I'd grown to crave. "Thank you for sitting through that. I know it's not how you wanted to spend your afternoon." "I'm learning," I said, playing with the buttons on his shirt. "Understanding how your world works, what you deal with, why certain decisions are necessary, even when they're brutal. You shouldn't have to learn these things," he said, his hand stroking up my spine. "You should be finishing your degree, working some normal job, dating some normal man who doesn't have blood on his hands. But I'm here instead," I said, meeting his dark eyes. "With you by choice. Are you sure it's choice?" He challenged that self-awareness that made him more than just a monster surfacing. "Or have I just trapped you so effectively that you've convinced yourself you want this?" It was a question I'd asked myself 100 times in the quiet moments, trying to separate genuine feelings from Stockholm Syndrome, trying to understand if I'd fallen in love with Antonio Rosini, or just the safety and security he provided. But when I looked at him, saw the vulnerability beneath the armor, remembered the gentleness with which he touched me, and the care he took with my mother's treatment, I knew the truth was more complicated than simple captivity. "I'm sure," I said, and kissed him to prove it, slow and deep and full of the certainty I felt even when logic said I should run. When we broke apart, both breathing harder, he rested his forehead against mine. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice carrying a weight that made anxiety spike through me. "Something I should have told you weeks ago, but I was afraid it would drive you away." My stomach clenched. "What?" He took a breath, his hands tightening on my waist like he was bracing for impact. "I knew who you were before that night at Billionaire. I'd known for months. I'd been watching you, making sure you were safe, keeping tabs on your mother's treatment, ensuring Salvatore or anyone else didn't target you because of your father." The words hung between us, and I processed them slowly, understanding dawning. "You orchestrated everything. The job at Billionaire, the VIP dinner, the money for my mother's treatment, all of it was planned." "Yes," he admitted, not trying to soften the truth. "Vincent owes me favors. I made sure you got the job, made sure I'd be there that night, made sure you'd have no choice but to accept my help when your mother needed treatment. I manipulated the circumstances to bring you into my world. I should have been furious, should have felt violated by the revelation that my choices had been illusions, that he'd been pulling strings all along. But underneath the shock was a strange sense of inevitability, like some part of me had always known this had been too convenient to be coincidence." "Why?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "Why go to all that effort for the daughter of a cop who tried to bring you down?" Antonio's expression was raw, unguarded in a way I'd rarely seen. "Because I owed your father a debt. Because 5 years ago, when the order came down to kill him and his team, I argued against it. I was overruled by my father and the old guard. But I tried to stop it. And when I couldn't, when your father died anyway, I promised myself I'd look after you if you ever needed it." Tears burned in my eyes, unexpected and unstoppable. "You're telling me that the man who runs the organization that killed my father has been protecting me out of guilt?" "Out of responsibility," he corrected. "Out of the knowledge that your father was a good man who died because he threatened corrupt people who deserved to be exposed. Out of the belief that his daughter shouldn't have to suffer for his courage." "And the rest of it?" I asked, needing to understand. "The protection from Salvatore, the relationship we've built, the way you look at me like I'm something precious. Was that manipulation, too?" No, he said emphatically, his hands cupping my face, forcing me to meet his eyes. That was real, Ava. All of it. I brought you into my world out of duty, but I kept you here because I fell in love with you. Because you're brave and strong and refuse to be broken. Because when you look at me, you see the man I'm trying to become, not just the monster I've been. I wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that what we'd built was genuine despite its manipulated foundation. But doubt crept in, insidious and corrosive, making me question everything I'd felt, every choice I'd made. I need time, I said, climbing off his lap, putting distance between us because his proximity made it too hard to think clearly. I need to process this, figure out what's real and what's just conditioning. Pain flashed across his face, quickly masked. Of course, take all the time you need. I'll have Elena prepare a different suite if you want space. No, I said, surprising myself. I don't want a different suite. I just need a few hours to think. I left before he could respond, walking through the mansion that had become my home, my prison, my sanctuary, trying to separate my feelings from the circumstances that had created them. I found myself in the conservatory, surrounded by exotic plants and the soothing sound of a fountain, and let myself cry for the first time since everything began. I cried for my father, killed by corruption that Antonio had been a part of, even if he'd opposed it. I cried for my mother, kept alive by money earned through crime and violence. I cried for the woman I'd been 3 months ago, exhausted and struggling, but at least morally certain. And I cried for the woman I'd become, who loved a criminal and was complicit in his violence, and couldn't imagine leaving him despite every reason she should. Elena found me an hour later, sitting on a marble bench with tears dried on my face and a strange calm settling over me. She sat beside me without asking permission, her usual professional demeanor softened by something that looked like sympathy. He told you, she said, not a question. How long have you known? I asked. From the beginning, she admitted. I was the one who vetted you, who confirmed you were Thomas Morrison's daughter, who suggested the approach Mr. Rossini ultimately took. You helped him manipulate me, I said, but there was no heat in the accusation, just exhaustion. I helped him protect you, she corrected gently. You have to understand, Miss Morrison, in our world, protection often looks like control. Mr. Rossini saw a woman drowning in circumstances she didn't deserve, and he threw her a life preserver. That the life preserver came with strings attached doesn't make the drowning less real. That's a convenient justification, I said. Perhaps, she agreed. But it's also true. You needed help. He provided it. Everything that's happened since, the connection you've built, that's been genuine. I've worked for Mr. Rossini for 15 years, and I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. How does he look at me? I asked, needing an outside perspective. Like you're the first good thing that's happened to him in his entire life, Elena said softly. Like he'd burn down everything he's built if it meant keeping you safe. Like loving you has made him want to be better than he is. Her words settled something in me, confirming what I'd seen in his eyes but had been afraid to believe. Antonio Rossini loved me genuinely and completely despite or maybe because of how we'd started. And I loved him. God help me. Loved him with a certainty that transcended logic and morality and everything I'd been taught about right and wrong. Thank you, I said to Elena, who simply nodded and left me to my thoughts. I spent another hour in the conservatory, working through the implications of Antonio's revelation, examining my feelings under the harsh light of truth, and ultimately reaching the same conclusion I'd arrived at weeks ago. I was dangerous when I was with him, and I wanted that danger. I wanted the power of being loved by someone who controlled an empire. I wanted the security of knowing he'd kill anyone who threatened me. I wanted the complexity of a relationship built on blood and necessity and genuine affection. When I finally returned to find him, it was late evening, and he was in his study staring out the window with a glass of scotch in his hand, looking more alone than I'd ever seen him. He turned when I entered, his expression carefully neutral, braced for rejection. I've made my choice, I said, crossing the room to stand in front of him. I choose you. I choose this life, this world, whatever it means. I choose us. Relief washed over his features, so profound it was almost painful to witness. Ava. But I have conditions, I interrupted, needing to establish some boundaries, some agency in a situation where so much had been decided for me. No more secrets, no more manipulation, no matter how well-intentioned. If we're doing this, we're doing it as equals or as close to equal as we can be given your world. Agreed, he said immediately. Anything else? I want to be involved, I said, the decision forming even as I spoke it. Not just decorative, not just waiting in the mansion while you handle business. I want to understand your operations, meet your people, be part of the decisions that affect my life. If I'm going to be yours, you have to let me be dangerous, too. A slow smile spread across his face, dark and approving. There's the fire I've been waiting for. The woman who walks into danger with her eyes open, who chooses power instead of victimhood. Is that a yes? I challenged. That's a yes, he said, pulling me against him. His mouth finding mine in a kiss that was possessive and celebrating and full of promise. When we broke apart, both breathless, he kept his arms around me. You're going to be magnificent, Ava. Dangerous and powerful and absolutely mine. Ours. I corrected. If this is going to work, it has to be ours, not just yours. He agreed and sealed the promise with another kiss. The next 6 months transformed everything. Antonio kept his word, bringing me into his business gradually but completely. I attended meetings, learned the structure of his organization, understood the delicate balance of power that kept his empire running. I met his associates, his business partners, both legitimate and criminal, and learned to navigate the social dynamics of a world where respect was earned through strength and loyalty, and was rewarded with protection. My mother's health continued to improve, and when she was finally released from the facility, Antonio arranged for her to move into a cottage on the estate grounds, close enough to receive care but far enough to maintain independence. She asked questions about my relationship with Antonio, concerned but ultimately accepting when she saw how he treated me, how he looked at me like I hung the moon. I never told her the full truth about his world, about what he did and how he'd orchestrated our meeting. That much was clear. Certain things were better left unvoiced. Some truths were simply too weighty, too burdensome to lay on someone who only wished for her daughter's happiness and safety. And I was happy, albeit in a complicated, morally questionable sort of way. The woman I used to be would have been appalled, but this new version of myself, she felt right, she felt correct. Antonio's promise to avenge my father slowly but surely materialized. We collaborated, painstakingly gathering evidence against the corrupt officials who had ordered the hit, constructing a case so airtight it couldn't be ignored or swept under the rug. Once we had amassed everything we needed, Antonio orchestrated the leak of information to federal investigators, ones who weren't on anyone's payroll, triggering an investigation that would eventually take down 3 city councilmen, a judge, and a deputy commissioner. I watched the news coverage, a sense of grim satisfaction washing over me as I saw the men responsible for my father's death being led away in handcuffs, their carefully constructed lives of corruption crumbling around them. It wasn't the justice system working as it should. It was Antonio Rossini leveraging his vast resources to exact revenge on my behalf. But the end result was the same. Accountability for crimes that had gone unpunished for far too long. How do you feel? Antonio asked, settling in beside me as we watched the perp walks unfold on the evening news, his arm gently draped around my shoulders. Like I can finally breathe, I confessed. Like my father's death actually means something now, like his sacrifice wasn't in vain. He'd be proud of you, Antonio said softly. Thomas Morrison's daughter, who dismantled the corrupt system he died fighting, even if the methods weren't exactly by the book. He was a practical man, I said, recalling my father's pragmatism, his unwavering belief that justice mattered more than blind adherence to procedure. I think he'd understand. As winter gave way to spring, Antonio began fulfilling his promise to legitimize his operations. It was a slow, deliberate process, disentangling the organization from its illicit activities while simultaneously maintaining the power and influence necessary to keep everyone safe. He consulted with lawyers and accountants, restructured businesses, and gradually pivoted toward enterprises that wouldn't land us all in federal prison. Some of the old guard balked at the changes, uncomfortable with the transition, preferring the familiar comfort of violence to the uncertainty of legitimacy. Antonio dealt with the resistance with his characteristic efficiency, offering generous retirement packages to those willing to step aside and more permanent solutions to those who presented actual threats. I refrained from asking for specifics. I had learned the art of knowing when not to delve too deeply into the methods that maintained the stability of our world. It was a balmy May evening when Antonio escorted me to the private terrace where we had shared our first dinner. The gardens now in full bloom, the air thick with the sweet fragrance of jasmine and roses. We had just returned from visiting my mother, who was now well enough to complain about being bored and to inquire about when I planned to give her grandchildren. A question that brought a secretive, satisfied smile to Antonio's face. "I have something for you," he said, producing a small velvet box from his pocket. My heart skipped a beat because I knew what this was. I had been anticipating it, dreading it, and desperately wanting it all at the same time. He opened the box, revealing a ring that stole my breath away. A platinum band featuring a deep red ruby surrounded by diamonds. It was elegant yet bold, and somehow perfectly embodied the person I had become. It wasn't traditional, it wasn't safe, but it was breathtakingly beautiful. "Ava Morrison," he said, dropping to one knee with a grace that made the formal gesture seem entirely natural. "You walked into my world hating me, determined only to survive, and you transformed everything. You made me want to be a better man, to build something worth preserving, to believe that monsters could be redeemed if they had the right motivation. Marry me, choose me permanently, let me spend the rest of my life protecting you, being dangerous with you, and loving you more than I ever thought possible." Tears streamed down my face, a mix of happiness, overwhelming emotion, and absolute certainty. "Yes," I said, pulling him to his feet and kissing him to seal the promise we were making. "Yes, I'll marry you. I'll choose you every day for the rest of my life." He slid the ring onto my finger, and it fit perfectly because, of course, he had had it sized without my knowledge. Antonio Rossini planned everything 3 steps ahead and paid attention to details that others overlooked. We stood on the terrace, embracing as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the gardens in hues of gold and rose. And I thought about the woman I had been just 6 months prior. Exhausted, drowning in despair, consumed by hatred for a man she had never even met. That woman would have been horrified by the person I had become, the fiancé of a mafia boss, complicit in his world, aiding him in consolidating power under the guise of justice. But that woman had been crumbling under the weight of circumstances beyond her control. The woman I had become had learned to transform pain into power, victimhood into agency, hatred into a complex, all-consuming love. "What are you thinking?" Antonio asked, his arms encircling me from behind, his chin resting gently on my shoulder. "That I probably should regret this," I confessed. "That I should be ashamed of falling in love with you, of helping you, of becoming a part of your world. But I can't regret the only thing that's made me truly happy in years." "No regrets," he agreed, pressing a tender kiss to my temple. "Only forward, only together, only dangerous, only dangerous," I echoed, and I meant it. We were married in a private ceremony 3 months later. Just family and close associates. My mother shedding tears of joy while Elena oversaw every detail with her characteristic efficiency. I wore ivory silk and carried a bouquet of red roses. And as Antonio lifted my veil to kiss me as his wife, I saw reflected in his eyes the same fierce devotion that burned within my own heart. The reception was elegant and subdued by mafia standards, more akin to a family gathering than the ostentatious display some might have anticipated. I danced with my new husband beneath strings of twinkling lights in the garden, surrounded by individuals who would kill or die at his command. And yet, I felt safer than I had ever felt in my life, because I was Ava Rossini now, protected by a man who would set the world ablaze to ensure my safety. Powerful in my own right, dangerous by choice. Later that night, Alone in the suite we would now share as husband and wife. Antonio undressed me slowly, reverently, his hands tracing the contours of my body with a possessive tenderness that I had come to crave. We made love with the certainty of two people who had chosen each other despite every reason they shouldn't have, who had forged something genuine from manipulation, necessity, and undeniable affection. "I love you," he whispered against my skin, and I could hear the wonder in his voice, the disbelief that someone could love him, knowing everything he was. "I love you," I replied, and I meant it with every compromised corner of my heart. Every dangerous choice I had made, every line I had crossed to be with him, Monster Man, and everything in between. He held me tighter, and we drifted off to sleep, tangled together, dangerous and damned, and utterly convinced that we had made the right choice, that love could flourish even in the darkest of places, that monsters could transform into men when they had something worth fighting for. 6 months later, standing in the nursery we had prepared together, Antonio's hand resting on my pregnant belly, feeling our daughter kick, I reflected on the path that had led us here. My father would have hated what I had become, would have been appalled by the choices I had made. But deep down, he would have understood. I realized that sometimes survival necessitates becoming someone you never imagined. That sometimes love blossoms in the most improbable of places. That sometimes the only way forward is through the darkness. "What should we name her?" Antonio asked, his hands spread protectively across my stomach, possessive even before she was born. "Grace," I said, selecting a name that signified undeserved favor, divine mercy, the kind of salvation that neither of us had earned but had somehow found anyway. "Grace Morrison Rossini." "Perfect," he agreed, and kissed me with the gentle tenderness of a man who had learned that strength didn't always equate to violence, that power could be wielded with gentleness when protecting something precious. We stood together in the nursery, envisioning a future for our daughter that would diverge from our pasts, that would afford her choices we had never had, that would allow her to be dangerous or safe, as she preferred. And I knew with absolute certainty that regardless of the mistakes I had made along the way, regardless of the lines I had crossed, regardless of the person I had evolved into, this was precisely where I was meant to be, dangerous, loved, and finally, impossibly, at peace.